Hi, y'all. I hope everyone's doing well. This week I'll be talking about the celebrated author, ornithologist, conservationist, and MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, Dr. Joseph Drew Lanham, and his memoir, The Home Place, which is published in 2016. This is a continuation of the class's unit writing about the natural world. There are major and minor themes explored throughout the memoir, obviously, and I'm not going to list all of them or explain them for the sake of brevity, but for my purposes, I want to quickly point out two in particular, which are religion and ideas of God and divinity, as well as his meditation on race. And each theme can definitely stand on its own to be discussed at length on a separate presentation, but I'm mentioning them now because both will overlap with my discussion of my actual chosen theme. And that is the thing that struck me most, which was Lanham's self portrait as it reflects an individual made up of and striving for balance between two worlds, which is what I'll be focusing on for my presentation. While his story is focused on a constantly developing sense of self and growth into who he is as an adult, which is a common memoir topic, Lanham labels himself an anomaly in many aspects of his life. This is why in many of the physical and or psychic localities he describes, he feels either caught straddling two schools of thought or feels as though he has one foot in and one foot out of a single school of thought at any given time. So, for my presentation, I'll be discussing several examples of this theme of balance between two extremes. I'll also be connecting the examples I've chosen from the book to my outside sources, which are pulled from articles Lanham has written, which emphasizes balancing act and why it has not only defined his life as he presents it through writing, but also the work he's continuing to do and why he clearly feels it's an important frame for which to commence with his work in this stage in his career. And I'll wrap up with some brief thoughts on the relevance and significance of the theme, so why it's important in this memoir and why it relates to our class, and then I'll give you all the discussion prompt for the week. There are a ton of examples of where Lanham places himself as being in between two extremes or as striking some balance between two worlds, and I don't have time to go into every single one, but here are the ones I feel are most important. First, being raised in a combination of his grandmother's house, which was seemingly stuck in the at least late 1800s, and the modern life of his parents' house, which was set in the 60s and 70s. In describing them, he writes that while the two structures were close together physically, they were almost a century apart in mindset. The houses and the space that lay between them were symbolic of the worlds I straddled modern convenience and comfort versus old time, bare bones simplicity. He describes both mindsets as guides that live in him and will continue to live into him until he dies. It's an appreciation for the more natural and the more domestic that lays a foundation for most of the other balancing acts he works into the memoir. And in that balance between supernatural beliefs, which involve superstition and conjuring, he describes them practiced by his grandmother, and the very practical focus on facts, practicality, and a no nonsense view of the world he picked up from his dad. His personality reflects that binary, and he describes himself as being torched to be unbalanced, a mystical type A. Between his parents and his grandmother and the excursions out into the natural world of the home place, we see developing an appreciation for that mystical, but also that practical, creating an explorer and a scientist out of the younger Lanham that we see reflected in his adult years. Next up is the discussion of wildness versus domesticity that Lanham feels defines him. This relates in a sense back to the worlds defined for him between his grandmother and his parents, or the wanderer and the scientist duality that I mentioned, but he deepens this duality much more as he describes wildness from an adult perspective. He says he'll never be completely wild, never truly leave the domesticated world where expectations and feelings rule. But I try to live half wild, not judging, skirting convention and expectation. This duality is conditioned by a childhood experience, but is also something he chooses to embrace, which makes it unique. It's a mindset that he feels expands his life and cements his sense of self and frees him from oppressive preconceptions that humanity sometimes cling to, especially based on his personal experiences as a man of color. And that said, the most interesting balance I feel is his discussion of being what he feels is an anomaly between being a proud black man but also being a PhD level ornithologist and conservationist. This one's unique in that these two things don't contrast at all, or at least they shouldn't be mutually exclusive. But Lanham explains how he feels they are because they contradict in the mind of public opinion and their rarity in his experience. He basically says that in choosing to go into birding, he was aware he would always feel at least a little like the odd one out, which he compares to a raven in a horde of white doves. This, in particular, is where that theme of racial experience in the field comes into play, as in his writing he has recounted several stories of either experiencing overt racism or just feeling slightly isolated by how rarely he meets another person of color who is a professional research ornithologist. Finally, we have the science and hard data versus humanism in conservation and teaching that Lanham embraces in the later chapters and in the second phase of his career. Lanham's whole message is that conservation must be measured in data, but compelled in hearts and minds. He mentions his awareness that spouting statistics about diminishing populations or facts about natural destruction aren't actually what will get the greater public involved in naturalist efforts. What had changed his career to this focus had been hearing from other passionate and charismatic conservationists, and from being out in the wilderness, away from everything and everyone. He references feeling his very being expand to fill the world when he's in nature, and it's there that he feels the most strongly about saving the natural world from destruction. It's clear that even though he's a scientist, he has an exceedingly creative mind as well, which is evident not just in his artful storytelling and vivid language, but in the means by which he is attempting to bring this message to the world, with what he describes as his head and heart method. Despite all these mentioned dualities, there is one thing that is steady and constant, and which keeps Lanham balanced, and that's nature. Nature to Lanham is constantly changing and developing, but always present and certain. He finds a sort of divinity in it, and he is attracted to the idea of nature and God being the same thing. Nature and how we frame ourselves to place into the natural world are critical to Lanham's balance and sense of self, not just his sense of peace. He writes that place and land and nature, how we tie these things together, is critical to our sense of self purposes and our fit in the world. These dualities that require balance can be found everywhere in Lanham's career. Even on his Clemson faculty profile page, his description reads, Drew strongly believes that conservation must be a blending of head and heart, rigorous science, and evocative art. In the semi-comedic article, 9 Rules for the Woke Birdwatcher, he writes, Keep your personal field guide close. Equity is a hard bird to find. Diligently search for it in places with common ground. Listen intently to the stories of others, just as you would strain in the dim dawn hours to discern the lisps of migratory birds overhead. Discomfort is growth. The head and heart method he has promoted is featured everywhere he's mentioned, and I wanted to highlight this because it denotes his presence that he seems to imbue into all of his work, but especially into this memoir. We've talked about the presence of the author in their memories and the telling of their story, and we see every single aspect of the world through Lanham's eyes. He wrangles not only these complicated dualities and his own memories and writing, while recounting a lifetime wrangling of sense of self caught in the intersection of so many conflicting ideologies and perspectives. I personally think it's a great way to rather simply tell a complicated personal history, and I recommend if y'all like the book to look into the other articles and links I've put in here to essays he's written, especially to Audubon or Orion Magazine. So, for the discussion forum for this week, I want to open it up with this question. Lanham's duality between wanting to embrace wildness and eschew domesticity, and vice versa, appear throughout the text. On page 142, he remarks that he'll never be completely wild. Why do you think this is? Does wild, as it is used in relation to Lanham, mean actually giving up all civilization and living a feral existence? If not, what other possible meaning might Lanham be placing on the term wildness? All right, and here is my works cited for the memoir as well as the extra sources I've referenced. I hope you guys enjoyed, and thank you so much for your time. I'll see y'all in the forum.